All right, let's get right into it. We're about to unpack one of the most incredible turnarounds in modern economic history. Seriously, we're talking about how an entire continent, literally in ashes, managed to rebuild itself into an economic powerhouse in just a couple of decades. It's this amazing story of desperation, brilliant design, and some seriously high-stakes geopolitics.
So, to really get this scale of the comeback, you first have to picture the utter disaster of 1945. I mean, imagine Europe. It's not just damaged, it's in a state of ruin we never seen before. Your roads, your bridges, your railways, gone. Factories that powered the economy, obliterated. People were facing mass starvation. The whole idea of a stable, democratic Europe was genuinely on the brink of collapse.
And yet, and this is what's so wild, what comes next after all that devastation is a period of such incredible prosperity that the French actually named it Les Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. For 3 straight decades, Western Europe's economies just exploded, growing at a pace that was double their historical average. They had jobs for almost everyone and a kind of stability that made the old boom and bust cycles feel like a thing of the past.
So, that's the big question, right? How in the world do you go from total, absolute ruin to a golden age? How do you turn rubble into wealth? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down right now.
First thing to know, this recovery was not an accident. Not even close. It was designed. And the first piece of the puzzle is this radical new blueprint for the entire global economy that was drawn up before the war was even over.
To understand this new system, you have to get what was driving its creators. People like John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, they were absolutely haunted by the 1930s. They saw a direct line from the economic chaos of the Great Depression straight to the rise of fascism and the horror of World War II. They were determined, absolutely determined, not to let that happen again.
So their vision was basically the polar opposite of everything that failed before. They looked at the mistakes of the 30s and systematically built a solution for each one. Instead of countries throwing up tariffs and closing themselves off, the new goal was open, multilateral trade. Instead of everyone devaluing their currency to try and undercut their neighbors, they built a system of stable, fixed exchange rates. The core idea was simple: stop the economic warfare and start cooperating.
And this new rule book was called the Bretton Woods system. The best way to think about it is like a new operating system for the world's economy. The whole point was to create stability and predictability so businesses could actually feel confident enough to invest, hire, and trade across borders again.
So how did it work? Well, the mechanics were actually pretty straightforward. Step 1, all the major currencies were pegged to the US dollar at a fixed rate. Step 2, the dollar itself was pegged to gold. That made the US dollar the anchor of the whole system. And step 3, they created 2 new global institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, to act as the referees and help keep everything running smoothly.
Okay, but here's the catch. A brilliant long-term plan is one thing, but surviving the immediate crisis on the ground, that's a whole other ballgame. And right then, Europe was facing a massive, immediate problem that threatened to sink the whole project before it even started.
It was called the dollar gap, and it's a terrifyingly simple problem. To rebuild, to even feed their people, European countries had to import tons of stuff from America: food, fuel, machines. The problem? After the war, they were completely broke. They had no US dollars left. They literally couldn't afford to buy the things they needed to survive.
And you have to understand, the stakes here were astronomical. We're talking about the very real possibility of mass starvation, of societies just collapsing. And for American leaders, there was another huge fear. Powerful communist movements were gaining ground in places like France and Italy, which could open the door for the Soviet Union to expand its influence across the continent. So Bretton Woods was the blueprint, but it needed a catalyst. It needed a massive jumpstart to solve that dollar gap and get the engine of the European economy turning again. That jumpstart was the Marshall Plan.
And because the situation was so dire, this all happened incredibly fast. The idea was floated in mid-1947, and by early 1948, it was passed by Congress and already up and running. It was one of the most decisive policy moves of the entire century.
The headline number was just staggering: $13 billion in aid sent to Western Europe. Now, what's so critical to understand here is that this wasn't a bunch of loans. No, the vast majority of this money was given as straight-up grants. A gift.
And to give you a sense of scale, that $13 billion, that was about 1% of the entire US economy at the time. It was a truly extraordinary commitment.
The impact was immediate, and it was dramatic.
The aid just shattered the cycle of despair. In the years the plan was active, the economies that got the aid grew by an amazing 15 to 25%. That dollar shortage eased almost overnight. They could finally import the fuel and the parts they needed to get their factories humming again.
But here's the thing. The most important, long-lasting impact of the Marshall Plan, it actually wasn't the money. It was something else entirely. It was about the strings that came attached to that money.
Yeah, a lot of historians now argue that the plan's real genius was the political and institutional leverage it gave the United States. The money was the carrot, right? But it came with some very specific instructions.
America didn't just hand over a blank check. It basically said, hey, you want this aid? Then you have to start working together. It forced these old rivals to coordinate their recovery plans, to start tearing down the trade barriers between them. And this pressure led directly to new organizations like the European Payments Union that made it easier for them to trade with each other. It really laid the first paving stones for what would eventually become the European Union. So when you look back, the Marshall Plan did so much more than just rebuild factories. It essentially locked Western Europe into the American-led capitalist world order. It kneecapped the influence of communist parties and kicked off a whole new era of European cooperation that has, fundamentally shaped the world we all live in today.
After 2 world wars in just 30 years, I mean, Europe was in ruins. It was absolutely shattered. So the question for its leaders wasn't just, how do we rebuild? It was something much, much bigger. How do we break this continent's horrifying cycle of violence for good? Okay, let's dive into this incredible story of how they tried to solve what really seemed like an impossible puzzle. And this right here was the core question. This wasn't about signing another treaty or making more promises that, could just be broken down the line. No, this was about fundamentally rewiring the entire continent to make war between old enemies like France and Germany a physical and economic impossibility. And this really gets to the heart of the dilemma they were facing. Look, for Europe to get back on its feet, it absolutely needed the economic engine of German industry. There was no way around it. But that was the exact same industrial power that had fueled a devastating war machine twice. So how on earth could you have one without unleashing the other? Well, the answer didn't come from some grand peace conference. It came from a truly radical idea, a blueprint cooked up by a brilliant French technocrat, Jean Monnet, and then announced to the world by the French foreign minister, Robert Schuman. And once the idea was out there, things moved incredibly fast. The declaration in May 1950 set out the vision. Less than a year later, in April 51, 6 nations, France, West Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries, signed the Treaty of Paris. And by July 1952, the European Coal and Steel Community, the ESCC, was a real thing. It was up and running. Now, what made this so wild, so completely new, was the concept at its core, supranationalism. Think about that for a second. This had never really been done before. These were proud, sovereign nations voluntarily agreeing to hand over control of a vital piece of their economy to a higher, independent body, a body that could make decisions that they all had to follow. And the logic behind it was just elegant. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Coal and steel, those were the absolute essential ingredients for any modern army. So by pooling all of it under one roof, under a single authority, France and Germany were basically tangling up their ability to make war so tightly that it would become, in their own words, materially impossible for one to turn against the other. You can't build tanks if someone else controls your steel. And just look at this structure they created. This is basically the DNA of today's European Union. You can see the beginnings of the European Commission in that high authority. The Council of Ministers, the Parliament, the Court of Justice, it's all right there. This institutional blueprint was baked in from the very beginning. But filled with confidence from this huge success, the founders got a little ambitious. They started asking, hey, if this works for coal and steel, why not for soldiers? And that question, well, that led to the very first major crisis for this whole European project. The big idea was to create something called the European Defense Community. We're talking about a single, integrated European army. But it turned out that jumping from economic cooperation to a shared military was a leap way too far. So here's the crucial difference. Nations were willing, just, to delegate sovereignty over some economic assets, like coal and steel. But giving up control of their own national armies, their own soldiers, no way. That stuff touches the absolute core of what it means to be a country. And in the end, it was the French National Assembly itself, that voted the treaty down. The collapse of the defense community in 1954 sent shockwaves everywhere. Jean Monnet, the architect of the whole thing, even resigned in protest. For a moment there, it really looked like the entire experiment was dead in the water, completely stalled out by the powerful forces of nationalism. But here is where it gets interesting. Instead of just giving up, the leaders made a brilliant strategic pivot. They realized military union was a no-go, so they decided to double down on the one thing that had actually worked: economics. And that led them to a critical meeting in 1955, the Messina Conference. Now, at Messina, there were basically two competing ideas on the table. Molnay, he argued for vertical integration. Basically, let's just do the same thing again. Pick another specific sector, like atomic energy, and create another community. But the Benelux countries argued for something way bigger: horizontal integration. They said, let's create a broad common market for everything. And for small, trade-dependent countries like them, that was the only way they could really compete with the big guys like France and Germany. And you know what? In what became a huge turning point, the bigger, bolder, more ambitious vision won out. That single decision would go on to shape the next 60 years of European history. The result was the 1957 Treaty of Rome, which created the European Economic Community, or the EEC. And its goals were just massive. We're talking about a true single market, get rid of all tariffs between members, and allow the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. These, of course, became the famous four freedoms, the absolute bedrock of the common market. So the EEC was this massive economic success in the 1960s. I mean, growth was booming, but politically, everything kind of ground to a halt. The community basically hit a wall. So let's take a look at how they finally managed to break through that wall at the end of the decade. And that wall pretty much had a name: Charles de Gaulle. The French president was a fierce, fierce defender of national sovereignty. He caused the empty chair crisis by literally having France boycott meetings for months just to protect a country's right to veto. And not once, but twice, he blocked the United Kingdom from joining because he was worried it would just be a puppet for American influence. But after de Gaulle resigned, the leaders met at The Hague in 1969 and hammered out a masterful compromise. It had three parts. First, completion. This gave France what it really wanted: permanent funding for its farmers. Second, deepening. This started the first ever plan for a single currency to deal with all the monetary chaos. And third, widening, which finally broke the deadlock and opened the door for new countries to join, including the UK. This bargain was a total game changer. It broke years of political paralysis. And that widening part became a reality in 1973 when the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Denmark all joined, growing the community from the original 6 members to 9 and really setting the stage for the EU we know today.
Think about Europe right after World War II. Just ruins. You think it would take a century to recover. But what actually followed was decades of incredible prosperity. So what was the secret? Well, it turns out there wasn't just one secret, but 4. Today, we're going to explore the 4 totally unique and kind of brilliant answers that different European nations came up with for the exact same problem.
So what was this huge puzzle they were all trying to solve? Well, it's a conflict as old as time, right? It's capital versus labor. Business owners, they need stability and predictability so they can invest and plan for the long haul. And workers, they need those companies to be profitable so they can get good wages and job security. The massive question that hung over everything was, how in the world do you get these two sides who are often at odds to actually pull in the same direction?
Okay, to really get this, we have to throw out one big misconception: that there's just one thing called capitalism. It's not a one-size-fits-all system. This framework, called Varieties of Capitalism, is super helpful here. It shows that different countries basically built their own unique economic operating systems, completely different rulebooks for how companies, banks, unions, and the government are all supposed to interact with each other.
And that's exactly what we're going to break down in this explainer. We're going to look at 4 of these distinct playbooks: Germany's highly coordinated path, Sweden's really radical egalitarian gamble, Britain's more hands-off liberal approach, and the huge state-driven projects you saw in France and Italy. All right, first stop, Germany. Let's dig into how they built this incredibly coordinated system that led to what everyone calls the Wirtschaftswunder, their post-war economic miracle. This right here, this is the absolute core of the German philosophy. See, they just lived through the chaos of unregulated markets and then the total horror of absolute state control. So their answer was a third way. The government wasn't going to play the game, but it was going to be an incredibly powerful referee, making sure everyone played by the rules of fair competition.
And this philosophy actually has a name: ordoliberalism. It was born directly from the trauma of the past. The whole idea was to build an order, that's what ordo means, a strong legal framework where private companies could thrive but couldn't run wild. This framework was designed to stop monopolies and, crucially, to ensure prices stayed stable thanks to a fiercely independent central bank.
So how did they actually solve that capital labor problem? With a system that was mandated by law called Mitbestimmung, or co-determination. This wasn't just a friendly suggestion. It meant workers literally got seats on the supervisory boards of major corporations. It meant local works councils negotiated everything on the factory floor. And it meant wages were set in these very structured, centralized talks. What did all this create? A bedrock of trust, which let German companies focus on long-term quality instead of short-term fights. Okay, from Germany's obsession with order, let's jump to Sweden's incredibly audacious gamble. Their approach was totally different. It was led by the unions, and their main goal wasn't just growth, it was radical equality. So the Swedes developed this thing called the Rehn-Meidner model. And honestly, it was wildly ambitious. It was designed to achieve 4 goals at the exact same time that most economists would tell you are basically impossible to have together: full employment, super high growth, low inflation, and extreme equality. Now, how did they even try to do this? The engine for the entire system was the solidaristic wage policy. The principle sounds simple, but it was kind of brutal in practice. Equal pay for equal work, period. A machinist at a super profitable export giant got paid the same as a machinist at a small, struggling local shop. No exceptions. And check out what this did. It set up a powerful cycle of creative destruction. Those inefficient companies that couldn't afford the high national wage, they were deliberately driven out of business. But the really productive companies, they were massive winners. Their wage costs were actually held down by the policy, which gave them huge profits to pour back into new technology. And the state's role was to be the ultimate safety net, catching all the displaced workers, retraining them, and moving them into those booming new industries. What's so amazing is that this effectively turned the entire labor movement into an engine for modernization. Swedish workers weren't scared of new machines or automation because their security wasn't tied to their specific job. It was tied to a powerful system that guaranteed them a place in the new, more advanced economy. All right, let's hop across the channel to the UK. Now, their liberal approach was different again. On one hand, it delivered an incredible welfare state. But on the other, it had this deep-seated instability baked right into the system that would cause problems for decades. So right after the war, a really powerful political consensus formed in Britain, often called the Attlee Settlement. And it rested on these 3 massive pillars that both major parties basically agreed on for a long time: a cradle-to-grave welfare state, nationalized key industries, and an absolute ironclad commitment to full employment. But, and this is the absolute key, here's where Britain was so different from Germany or Sweden. They never actually built the institutions for cooperation. You had companies that were really focused on short-term profits and a union movement that was very powerful, but also deeply fragmented and pretty confrontational. There was just no central table for everyone to sit around and hammer out a coordinated national strategy.
And because of that institutional weakness, the UK got trapped in this miserable, recurring cycle known as stop-go. Here's how it worked. The government would hit go, pumping up the economy to get to full employment. Then, local unions, without any central coordination, would demand huge wage hikes, which caused inflation to spike. That made British exports too expensive, leading to a crisis. So the government had to hit stop, slamming on the brakes with higher taxes and interest rates, causing a recession, only to start the whole painful cycle over again a few years later.
Okay, for our last model, let's head south to France and Italy. Here, the state wasn't just a referee or a safety net. No, the state was the star player, the head coach, and the team owner all rolled into one. It took the lead in driving industrialization from the very top.
Now, both France and Italy went all in on heavy state intervention, but they used slightly different tools. In France, you had these powerful national plans that basically directed money from state-owned banks into strategic industries like steel and energy. In Italy, the state used a massive portfolio of companies that had inherited from the Mussolini era to build highways and provide cheap steel and power to private manufacturing champions up in the north.
The French approach is so famous, it has its own name: dirigisme. In this system, you had a small, highly trained elite of civil servants who, operating pretty much outside of politics, would just design the country's economic future. They decided which industries to back and which to let go, marginalizing both unions and small businesses in the process.
And in a top-down model like this, you can probably guess what labor relations were like. They were super confrontational. It wasn't about cooperative bargaining, it was about rigid legal codes. And this created a stark two-tiered system. You had insiders with jobs for life in state-owned firms with incredible protections, but then you had outsiders, young people, workers in small private firms, who were left totally vulnerable. The result? Unions really only had one big weapon: frequent, massive, politically charged strikes.
Phew! Okay, let's pull all this together. We've just walked through 4 profoundly different solutions: German order, Swedish solidarity, British conflict, and French-Italian state direction, all created to solve the same fundamental post-war problem.
And this table really just lays it out so clearly, doesn't it? Germany built a system of institutionalized cooperation. Sweden used its powerful unions to literally drive creative destruction. The UK, relying on a vague consensus without the institutions to back it up, got stuck in a fragmented and adversarial rut. And France and Italy? They went with a top-down, state-led model that was often intensely political and antagonistic. These weren't just economic choices, they shaped these entire societies for generations.
Imagine an economic boom so powerful, it literally rebuilds a continent from rubble, wipes out extreme poverty, and creates a whole new way of life for millions. Now, imagine it all coming crashing down in one chaotic decade. Well, this isn't some made-up story. This is the real, dramatic tale of post-war Europe's golden age and how it all fell apart.
For almost 30 years after World War II, the economies of Western Europe were growing at an average real rate of over 4% every single year. Now, to put that into perspective, that is a rate of expansion that had never been seen before in history. And honestly, we haven't seen anything like it since. It was a true economic miracle.
So the big question is, how on earth did this happen? Our story really kicks off in the ashes of the war, where, against all odds, the foundations for this incredible period of prosperity were laid.
And look, this wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This kind of insane growth completely transformed society. It meant the effective end of the kind of desperate poverty that had stalked Europe for centuries. For the very first time, millions and millions of regular people had money left over after paying the bills, leading to the birth of the modern consumer society we see in Europe today.
But a miracle on this scale doesn't just happen by chance, right? Nope. It was built on a very specific and very intentional set of foundations. So let's dive in and take a look at the 4 key pillars that made this whole thing work. You see, these 4 things work together in this really delicate, symbiotic way. You had governments building these huge social safety nets, the welfare state, which of course were paid for with a high tax model. At the same time, you had incredibly powerful trade unions making sure that workers got their fair share of all this new wealth. And holding it all together like the bedrock was a super stable global financial system called Bretton Woods.
And you can really see that commitment in the numbers here. I mean, to pay for things like universal healthcare, public universities, and massive new infrastructure projects, the tax state just grew and grew. You know, back in the 50s, the total tax take was maybe in the low 20s as a share of the economy, but by the late 80s, in places like Sweden, it was soaring past 50%.
And this number, 80%, this really speaks to the incredible power of organized labor during this time. In the Nordic countries, for example, where joining a union was often tied to getting unemployment benefits, union membership hit these just extraordinary peaks, covering the vast majority of all workers. And that, of course, gave labor massive, massive bargaining power.
For decades, this whole system seemed, well, invincible. It delivered growth, it delivered stability, and it delivered social peace. But then, in the late 60s and early 70s, the entire structure started to groan and crack under the weight of some huge external shocks. So to really get why it all fell apart, we have to understand the system's anchor, Bretton Woods. Basically, this was an agreement that pegged all the major global currencies to the US dollar, and the dollar itself was convertible to gold at a fixed price. What this did was create a super predictable, super stable environment for global trade, which was the absolute lifeblood of Europe's economy.
Then came the 1-2 punch. First, in 1971, the US just decided to sever the dollar's link to gold. Poof! Just like that, the Bretton Woods system was shattered, unleashing total chaos into the currency markets. Then, just 2 years later, the 1973 oil embargo caused the price of crude oil to quadruple practically overnight.
And if that wasn't enough, another, just as devastating, oil shock hit again in 1979.
Now, the really crucial thing to understand here is that Europe's entire industrial machine, the whole engine of the Golden Age, was built on one simple assumption: cheap energy. So these oil shocks were absolutely catastrophic. They basically acted like a giant, sudden tax on the entire continent, sucking wealth out and triggering a brutal recession.
The collision of this monetary chaos and the energy crisis created something new. A terrifying economic monster that nobody had ever seen before. A phenomenon that broke all the known rules and left governments completely, utterly paralyzed. And that monster was called stagflation. For the first time ever, economies were getting slammed by soaring unemployment and runaway inflation at the exact same time. This was supposed to be impossible. I mean, according to all the economic theories of the day, you had one or the other. You were never, ever supposed to have both.
And this slide shows you exactly why the old playbook just completely failed. The standard response to unemployment was for the government to spend more money to boost demand. Simple, right? But when they tried that during the oil crisis, it was a disaster. It was like pouring gasoline on an already raging fire. The result? No new jobs, just out-of-control hyperinflation.
But here's the thing. The crisis wasn't just about these external shocks. There was a deeper problem brewing inside the system itself, one that was ironically rooted in the massive success of the Golden Age. See, decades earlier, an economist named Michel Kalecki had predicted that if you have permanent full employment, you eventually, fundamentally, shift the balance of power toward workers, and that could become unstable.
And in the 1970s, his prediction came true. With the cost of living skyrocketing because of inflation, these powerful unions used their strength to demand huge wage increases to protect their members. Businesses would give in, but then they'd have to raise their prices to cover those higher wages, which of course just fueled even more inflation. And around it went in this destructive wage price spiral.
And you can see the brutal real-world result right here. Businesses were trapped in this impossible squeeze between skyrocketing energy costs on one side and skyrocketing wage demands on the other. They just couldn't absorb both. In the UK, for example, the profit rate for industrial companies just collapsed, from over 35% down to just 10% in the space of 2 years.
And with profits vanishing, well, why would anyone invest? Private investment fell off a cliff. Factories started closing their doors. Productivity growth ground to a halt. The Great Compromise, that cooperative spirit between business and labor that had powered the Golden Age for 30 years, it was over. Done.
Well, back in the 1970s, the global economy basically hit a brick wall. And for Europe, it forced a series of really painful choices. This is the story of how Britain, France, and West Germany each faced that exact same crisis. And in doing so, they pretty much set the stage for the world we live in today.
Stagflation. And for economists, this was just a total paradox. I mean, the rulebook said you were supposed to get either inflation or unemployment. You weren't supposed to get both at the exact same time.
Okay, so let's kick things off with Britain, where this crisis wasn't just a minor headache, it was an acute systemic meltdown. And the response was just as extreme, a kind of radical and very painful economic surgery that would change the country forever.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It really shows you how incredibly fast everything just fell apart. You have this reckless attempt to spend their way out of trouble in the early 70s, and boom, it leads to a complete economic catastrophe. It all ended in the ultimate national humiliation, having to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. That followed by massive nationwide strikes that basically shut the country down. The old system wasn't just broken, it was totally discredited.
And the sheer scale of the disaster, wow, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. 24%. In 1975, inflation in the UK peaked at a staggering 24%. Just try to imagine that for a second. The money in your pocket losing almost a quarter of its value in just 1 year. This wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet, it was a genuine national trauma. And of course, this kind of total chaos, it opens the door for radical change. And in walked Margaret Thatcher. Her core belief was a complete and total rejection of that post-war consensus. For her, the government wasn't the solution. The government was the problem, and she had a very radical plan to fix it.
And here's basically what she did. It was a complete overhaul. First, she just threw the old goal of full employment right out the window. The new mission?
crush inflation no matter the cost with absolutely punishing interest rates. She went to war with the powerful trade unions, sold off massive state-owned companies, and completely unleashed the financial markets. The whole idea was that competition and private enterprise were the only way to get the economy back on its feet.
Okay, so while Britain takes this incredibly sharp turn to the right, over in France they decide to do, well, the complete opposite. This is a fascinating story of a huge socialist experiment that ran headfirst into the brick wall of global economics.
And you can really see the clash of ideas right here. In 1981, just as Thatcher is deep into her cuts, France elects a socialist president, François Mitterrand, who promised to spend, spend, spend. It was a massive real-world experiment. The big question was, could one country really go it alone and create its own French road to socialism, defying the global trend?
And Mitterrand went all in. I mean, he was not messing around. His government jacked up the minimum wage, massively expanded social benefits, and flat out nationalized huge chunks of the economy. We're talking major banks and giant industrial companies. The whole goal was to insulate the French economy from these global pressures and drive growth from the top down.
But there was one giant, fatal flaw. The rest of the world was stuck in a recession. So when French people suddenly had more cash in their pockets, what did they do? Well, they didn't just buy French stuff. They went out and bought German cars and Japanese stereos. All that government stimulus money was essentially leaking out of the country and firing up other nations' economies instead of their own.
The result, a complete and utter disaster. How bad was it? Well, this bad. 3 times the French currency was forced into a humiliating devaluation. Yeah, the whole experiment just imploded, and fast. Speculators were hammering the French franc, money was flying out of the country, and in less than 2 years, the currency collapsed 3 times. By March of 1983, the game was up. Mitterrand had to hit the brakes, hard. He introduced what became known as the austerity turn, a total 180-degree flip. Public spending was slashed, and suddenly, fighting inflation became the #1 job. The French dream, it was over. All right, so we've got the radical revolution in Britain and the dramatic U-turn in France. But West Germany? Well, they took a completely different path. They navigated this whole crisis not with some big ideological crusade, but with some pretty amazing institutional strength. And this simple table honestly tells you almost everything you need to know. While pretty much the entire rest of the developed world was wrestling with crazy, out-of-control prices, West Germany's inflation stayed, well, pretty low. So how on earth did they pull that off? The secret really was in how their whole system was built. Unlike in Britain, where it was basically all-out war between the unions and the employers, the German system, they called it co-determination, kind of forced everyone to cooperate. You had this fiercely independent central bank, the Bundesbank, whose only job, and I mean its only job, was to keep prices stable. Then, you had the unions and employers actually coordinating to agree on sensible wage deals. The whole country was focused on long-term competitiveness, not just winning the next fight. Now look, this doesn't mean Germany was totally immune to the crisis. Things definitely slowed down and unemployment did rise. But, and this is the key point, their core industrial engine, the thing that made Germany Germany, it stayed intact. And that resilience is what really cemented its role as the undisputed economic leader of Europe. Okay, so we've covered 3 totally different stories, right? Let's pull it all together in this final section and figure out what these wildly different paths really mean for us today. This table really just lays it all out. You've got the UK with its neoliberal shock therapy. Yes, it crushed inflation, but it also gutted industry and supercharged the financial sector. Then there's France, which tried to go it alone, failed spectacularly, and basically learned the hard way that you can't fight the global economy by yourself. And finally, Germany, with its coordinated, moderate approach that allowed it to weather the storm and come out even stronger. But if there's one single crucial lesson from all of this, it's this, and the French experience really drives it home. The era of a country just doing its own economic thing sealed off from the rest of the world, that was over. That austerity turn in 1983 was a massive turning point. It was an admission that in our modern, financially integrated world, no single nation, no matter how powerful, could just defy the markets and run its own show.
What if I told you that a single piece of legislation, just one act, completely rewired modern Europe? Well, that's exactly the story we're getting into today. It's about how a continent that was absolutely gripped by pessimism and stagnation took this radical leap of faith with something called the Single European Act of 1986. Okay, so to really get what was going on, you have to understand the core problem. The continent had been diagnosed with eurosclerosis. And this wasn't just some catchy phrase, you know? It described a very real sickness in the European economy. Things were slowing way down, jobs were vanishing, and the old systems, they just weren't working anymore.
And you know, this went way beyond just economics felt in government buildings. It was a genuine crisis of confidence. This feeling, this pervasive, deeply pessimistic atmosphere had taken hold. It was a sense that maybe, just maybe, Europe's best days were already in the past.
So you can imagine this sparked a lot of fear among European leaders. They're looking across the Atlantic at the United States, which was dynamic and deregulating, and then they're looking east at the incredible industrial power of Japan. And they felt like they were getting left behind, stuck in this fractured, over-regulated past. But out of this crisis, a really bold, and a lot of people at the time would have said radical solution started to take shape. It was called the Single European Act, or the SEA for short. And we're not talking about a minor tweak here. This was a plan for a fundamental reinvention. And to give you a sense of just how huge this was, the Treaties of Rome were basically the foundationing documents of the entire European project. For 30 decades, 30 years, they had been left largely untouched. The SEA was the first time leaders decided to go back and perform major surgery on the very DNA of European integration. Now, a change this big doesn't just happen on its own. It was really pushed forward by this powerful and kind of unique coalition. You had the visionary leadership of Commission President Jacques Delors, you had a European Parliament that was really starting to find its voice, and, crucially, you had a united front of Europe's biggest multinational corporations who all saw a borderless continent as a massive, massive opportunity. And listen, this wasn't some fuzzy aspirational goal. The ECA set a hard, legally binding deadline, December 31st, 1992. By that date, Europe had to become a single, borderless market. This deadline, this ticking clock, created an absolutely incredible sense of urgency and momentum. So the big question is, how in the world were they going to pull this off? Well, it was all about completely rewriting the rulebook for the entire continent. They basically launched this three-part attack on all the friction in the economy. First, get rid of all the hidden national rules that were designed to protect local industries. Second, create one single European standard for products, so a widget made in Spain was the same as a widget made in Germany. And third, and this was huge, let capital, services, and people move freely across borders with no restrictions. Okay, but here's the thing. To make any of this work, they had to solve a massive political problem. For decades, any single country could just veto a big economic rule change it didn't like. That gridlock had to end. And the solution was a system called qualified majority voting. Essentially, what it meant was that no single country could hold the entire single market project hostage anymore. As long as a proposal had a supermajority of support, it would pass. This was the key that unlocked decades of gridlock. All right, so did it work? The creation of the single market was a massive success. But, and this is a really big but, it was a success that came with some profound and often pretty controversial consequences. You really see this two-sided legacy play out. On the one hand, you got this surge of economic dynamism. Companies were restructuring, they were merging across borders, and growth came back. But on the other hand, the whole balance of power shifted. With capital now free to move anywhere, multinational corporations gained immense leverage, which put downward pressure on wages and really strained the old social safety nets of the traditional welfare states. It was more than just an economic shift. It was a deep philosophical one. You could say Europe made this definitive historic transition, moving away from state-managed capitalism and toward a brand new model of hyper-competitive, market-driven integration. And what's so interesting is that the very success of this new integrated market created an unstoppable momentum. It turned out that having one big market almost made having one single currency feel, well, inevitable. When you look at the timeline, the path forward from here is just crystal clear. You could think of it like this. The ECA in '86 laid down the tracks. The completion of the single market in '92, that was the train. And the Maastricht Treaty in the early '90s was that train's final destination, the creation of the euro. You know, when you look at Europe today, it just feels like it's lurching from one crisis to the next, right? You've got debt, migration, energy, conflict. It all seems so chaotic, almost like a string of really bad luck. What if they're all symptoms of a much deeper issue?
one that was actually baked into the very architecture of the European Union from the very beginning.
And there's actually a word for this situation: polycrisis. And it's a really powerful idea. It means we're not just dealing with a simple to-do list of problems. The thing is, none of these crises exist in a vacuum. They're all interconnected. They feed off each other. They amplify each other. And in doing so, they expose these really profound structural vulnerabilities in the whole European project.
So that brings us to the big question of this whole explainer. Is Europe just having a really, really bad run of luck? Or was this crisis, all of it, the predictable result of how the euro was designed decades ago? To figure that out, we need to take a hard look at the blueprint itself. Okay, so let's rewind the clock. We're going back to 1992, to the Maastricht Treaty. This was the moment this incredibly ambitious, frankly historically unprecedented project of a single currency was born. But as we're about to see, that blueprint had a fundamental, maybe even fatal flaw right at its core. This slide just lays it all out, doesn't it? This is the essential and ultimately conflicting bargain at the heart of the euro. On one side, you've got a single centralized monetary policy. The European Central Bank in Frankfurt sets one single interest rate for everybody, from industrial Germany to sunny Greece. But, and this is a huge but, on the other side, fiscal policy. You know how countries tax and spend and run their budgets? That all stayed in national hands. So think about it. One monetary gas pedal for the whole car, but 19 different drivers, each with their own map. It created this structural imbalance from day one. So to try and manage this obvious tension, the architects came up with a set of really strict rules. They were called the convergence criteria. The whole idea was to force all these different economies to start acting the same. So they set these hard limits on things like government deficits. They had to be below 3% of GDP, and your total public debt couldn't go over 60%. And this is absolutely crucial. Germany insisted on a strict no bailout clause. The message was clear. Every country is on its own, no safety net.
And really, the entire project was built on this one massive, and you could say, very optimistic assumption that just the discipline of sharing a currency would magically force the poorer countries on the periphery to reform themselves and become as productive and efficient as the richer core countries, like Germany. The euro itself was supposed to be the medicine that would create this economic convergence. A huge bet. But here's the crazy part. Long before the euro even launched, the fragility of this entire system was, well, it was violently exposed. There was this massive, flashing red warning sign about the dangers of this design. A crisis that all of Europe saw happen, and then they just promptly ignored it.
So let's break down what happened, because it's a perfect preview of the problems to come. It starts in 1990 with German reunification. To control its own domestic inflation from that massive undertaking, Germany's central bank jacked up interest rates. But because other countries like the UK and Italy were in this precursor system to the euro, where their currencies were pegged to Germany's, they were forced to raise their rates too, even though their own economies were struggling and needed the opposite. The strain was just too much. On a single day that became known as Black Wednesday, the whole system just broke. The UK and Italy were forced out. It was a perfect and painful demonstration of how one country's domestic policy could unleash a crisis for everybody else.
And yet, even after that crystal clear, painful lesson, the political train had too much momentum. The dream of a unified Europe was just too powerful. So the economic warnings were pushed aside, and in 1999, the euro was launched anyway, setting the stage for what would become a decade-long illusion of prosperity. All right, let's fast forward to that first decade of the single currency. On the surface, man, everything looked fantastic. But underneath all that, the cheap money that was sloshing through the new system wasn't actually uniting Europe. It was quietly and dangerously pushing it apart.
And the effect of the euro was immediate, and it was dramatic. I mean, just look at this. All of a sudden, financial markets decided that lending money to the government of Greece was just as safe as lending it to Germany. The risk premium? It just vanished. Poof. And that unleashed an absolute torrent of cheap credit from the capital-rich north down to the south.
So what does a country like Greece do with all that cheap money? Well, take a look at this chart. Between 1999 and 2008, Greece's current account deficit, which is basically a measure of how much more they're buying from the world than they're selling to it, it exploded. It went from 5% of their economy to a truly staggering 15%. This wasn't productive investment, this was a massive, debt-fueled consumption boom. Okay, so if Greece was borrowing all this money, where was it coming from? Well, take a look at the other side of that coin, Germany. During that exact same period, Germany went from having a balanced account to running a massive surplus. So here's the crucial point. German savings were directly financing the Greek consumption boom. You had two economies locked together in the same currency, but heading in completely opposite directions.
And this wasn't just a Greek story. You saw the same pattern play out all across Europe's periphery. This flood of cheap capital didn't go into building new competitive export industries that could compete with Germany. No. Instead, it created these gigantic housing bubbles in Spain and Ireland, and it paid for totally unsustainable public and private spending in places like Greece and Portugal. All of it just widened the economic gap at the core.
So here we are, a decade in. And that big dream of convergence? Well, it didn't just fail, it actually did the opposite. The euro's flawed architecture hadn't created one Europe. It had created two very different Europes, sharing one currency, but operating on completely different economic models.
And this slide just spells it out perfectly. You had two completely different economic models trying to live under one roof. In the core, you had Germany. They implemented these painful labor market reforms, the famous Hartz IV reforms, which basically held down wages and made Germany into this hyper-competitive exporting machine. Meanwhile, over in the periphery, labor costs were actually rising, their industries were stagnating, and all that economic weakness was just being papered over by this boom in debt-fueled consumption. This rigid core-periphery divide was now locked firmly in place.
So let's bring it all together. The original architectural choices, the ones made back in 1992, they didn't create a strong, unified structure. No. Instead, that flawed blueprint built a divided house. You had a booming, export-driven core and a fragile, debt-laden periphery. It was a house that was deeply, deeply vulnerable to the first major storm that came along, which, of course, we now know was the 2008 global financial crisis.
All right, today we're going to dive into one of the biggest economic dramas of the 21st century. I'm talking about the Eurozone debt crisis. We're going to look at how a single currency, something designed to bring a continent together, actually pushed it right to the edge of a total collapse. Okay? Let's get into it.
So that's the big question, right? How on earth did one currency almost shatter an entire continent? It's a fascinating story, really. It's got flawed designs, huge global shocks, and some incredibly painful solutions that, honestly, people are still arguing about to this day.
Okay, so first things first, we've got to understand the fundamental problem here. The fatal flaw that was baked into the euro from the very beginning. You know, it was kind of like building a house where everyone shares the same roof, but nobody agreed on the foundation.
Now this slide just lays it all out. It shows the economic straitjacket these countries were in. See, if you're a sovereign nation, you've got a couple of escape hatches in a crisis. You can devalue your currency to make your exports cheaper, and your central bank can print money if things get really bad. But if you're in the Eurozone, you give both of those tools away. You're basically left with very few options when a big shock hits. And then bam! 2008 happens. The global financial crisis that kicked off in the United States, well, that was the major shock. It was the spark that lit the fuse in Europe, exposing all those deep-seated weaknesses and starting a chain reaction. The dominoes were about to fall.
And Greece? Wow. Greece got hit like a freight train. In late 2009, its new government came clean and revealed that the country's deficit was way, way worse than anyone had been told. It eventually peaked at a staggering 15.6% of its entire GDP.
And at the same time, its total government debt just exploded to over 126% of GDP. I mean, with a mountain of debt that big, investors got seriously spooked. They just stopped lending to Greece, which pushed the country right to the brink of bankruptcy.
But here's the scary part. This wasn't just a Greek problem. Oh no, this thing started to spread like wildfire. You had Ireland, the Celtic tiger, suddenly facing a massive deficit after its property bubble popped. You had Portugal and Spain getting hammered by insane borrowing costs and collapsing industries. The contagion was very real, and the entire Eurozone was now at risk. So with everything on the verge of a complete meltdown, a new group gets formed. They called it the Troika. It was the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF. And they came to the table with a radical and, let me tell you, deeply controversial plan to save the euro.
The big idea at the heart of their entire plan was this really tough concept called internal devaluation. The logic was, since a country like Greece couldn't just devalue its currency on the global market, the only other option was to force a devaluation inside the country by pushing down wages and prices to try and make the economy competitive again. So the Troika's game plan was pretty straightforward, at least on paper. Step 1, provide huge emergency loans to stop an immediate collapse.
But, and this is a big but, in return, they demanded massive cuts to government spending, what we all came to know as austerity. And on top of that, they pushed for major reforms to force wages down. And the hope was that all this pain would somehow make these economies competitive again.
But, these economic theories, they have real-world consequences. This is the part of the story where macroeconomic policy crashes head-on into the reality of people's everyday lives. And the human cost was just devastating.
I mean, just look at these numbers. It is absolutely horrifying. In both Greece and Spain, youth unemployment shot past 50%. Think about that for a second. More than half of an entire generation of young people were left with no job and no prospects. It scarred them for life.
And at the same exact time, people's paychecks were just collapsing. Real wages in Greece were slashed by as much as 30%. They fell by 10% in Portugal, 6% in Spain. This wasn't an accident. It was a direct result of the policies that dismantled collective bargaining and froze wages.
And this gets to a really critical point. A lot of analysts looked at this and said, hey, wait a minute, this isn't just about balancing the books, as you can see in this quote. They saw it as a deliberate top-down program that basically used mass unemployment as a weapon, a way to discipline labor and force a rapid free market restructuring of these economies.
So, this crisis didn't just wreck economies. It also kicked off this massive power struggle right at the heart of the European Union, a battle between institutions over power and policy that, to be honest, is still not settled today.
And then, in 2012, right when it felt like the euro was about to completely fall apart, the head of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, steps up and says these famous words. This promise to do whatever it takes was a massive turning point. It basically changed the entire game.
And this is where you see the central conflict really play out. To back up his promise, Draghi's ECB launched these huge bond buying programs, basically acting as the lender of last resort for the whole union. But Germany's highest court essentially said, not so fast. They repeatedly challenged the ECB, arguing these actions were illegal and that the bank had gone way beyond its authority.
You've got this political anger that's been simmering for years, and then bam, a sudden energy shock hits. These two things are colliding to create this double crisis that could genuinely threaten the whole idea of a united Europe. Okay, let's get right into it. Take a look at this. I mean, wow. This isn't just some small blip on the radar. What you're seeing here is the vote for parties that are, let's say, not fans of the whole European project. And it hasn't just gone up a little, it has quadrupled in about a decade. We're talking about a fringe idea becoming a major political force, pulling in over a quarter of all voters. That's not just a trend, that's a political earthquake. And figuring out why, well, that's the big puzzle we're going to try and solve today. So yeah, that number, it naturally leads us to the big question, right? The real question. Because seeing the numbers is one thing, but understanding what's behind them, that's the whole ballgame. What is actually driving all this discontent across an entire continent? Let's dig into the why. All right, first section. Now, it's really easy to look at this and just say, oh, it's a culture war. And, sure, that's part of it, but that's just scratching the surface. If you really want to get what's going on, what's behind this political fever, you got to follow the money. It almost always comes down to the economics. And here's the core idea, the thing you really need to grasp. None of this political chaos is happening in a vacuum. It's not random. It's like the smoke from a long, slow-burning fire. It's directly connected to decades of economic pain, factories closing down, entire industries disappearing, and that big promise of prosperity. For a whole lot of people, it just never showed up. Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. This economic pain, it's not spread out evenly across the map, like butter on toast. Not at all. It's concentrated in specific places. It has a real geography. And guess what? If you follow that map of pain, you'll find it leads you straight to the heart of the political discontent. Yeah, there's actually a fancy academic term for this. They call it a regional development trap. But what does that really mean? Well, just think of it like this. A place just gets stuck, completely stuck in the mud. It can't grow, it can't create new jobs, it's constantly falling behind its neighbors. It's basically trapped in this state of economic limbo, unable to move forward. And this quote, man, it just perfectly captures the human side of that dry academic term, right? This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet like GDP or productivity. It's about a feeling, a deep gut punch of a feeling that you and your entire community have been left behind, that you've become one of those places that don't matter,
to the people making decisions in the big, shiny capital cities.
Okay, so you've got this massive river of anger and frustration, but it doesn't just flow in one direction. Instead, it splits. It forks into two very different political streams. Two types of populism that look and sound different because they're feeding on two totally different kinds of economic anxiety. So let's break this down, because this is really the key. On one side, you've got left-wing populism. Think of this as a reaction to a sudden shock. It's a direct response to, say, brutal government cuts, the social safety net getting ripped out from under people. It's immediate anger. Then on the other side, you have right-wing populism. This is more of a slow burn. It's not about what you just lost, it's about what you're afraid of losing. Your job to a robot, your industry to another country, your social status. It's an anxiety about the future. And this isn't just theory, we have really clear examples. You look at Greece, right? The government imposes these massive cuts to social spending. Poverty skyrockets to 35%, and what happens? Boom, Syriza rises from nowhere to take power. Or look at Spain. You got mass youth unemployment, welfare cuts, and suddenly a new party, Podemos, is capturing all that outrage. See, it's a politics of immediate reaction.
But now, let's contrast that with the right-wing version. It's different. In Germany, for instance, the strongholds for the AfD aren't always the poorest places right now. Instead, they're the places where stable, good-paying manufacturing jobs are most threatened by automation. Or in France, the National Rally gets huge support from workers in old-school industries who are terrified of globalization and the green transition. It's not about the crisis of today, it's about the anxiety of tomorrow.
So you've got this continent already fractured, already on edge, and then, just when you think things can't get more complicated, a massive shockwave hits from the outside, an earthquake. The war in Ukraine wasn't just a geopolitical crisis, it was an economic bomb that went off and basically poured gasoline on all these political fires that were already burning. You gotta understand, for decades, the entire European economy was powered by one central engine, Germany. And the fuel for that German engine, it was cheap, seemingly endless natural gas flowing straight from Russia. The invasion in 2022 didn't just throw a wrench in that engine. It ripped the whole thing out, shattered it into a million pieces, basically overnight. And just look at this. I mean, this shows you the scale of the crisis. This isn't a gentle slope down, this is a sheer cliff. Russia literally just turned off the tap. This wasn't some market fluctuation. This was a deliberate, weaponized shutdown of the continent's lifeblood. And the price tag for this? Absolutely breathtaking. The EU's energy bill just exploded, shooting up to over 400 billion euros. Think about that. That's hundreds of billions of euros that could have been invested in new technologies, better hospitals, high-speed rail. Just gone. Sucked out of the economy just to keep the heat and lights on. So this energy shock, it wasn't just a problem. It was an existential threat. All of a sudden, energy policy went from being this boring, technical thing that nobody paid attention to being a question of pure survival for Europe's industries. The choice was simple: pivot, and pivot fast, or face total economic disaster. So what was the solution? Well, it was a mad scramble. In a desperate move, Europe basically swapped one dealer for another. They replaced that cheap Russian gas that came through a pipeline with expensive American gas that has to be liquefied and shipped all the way across the Atlantic. And here's the kicker. In escaping one dependency, they walked right into a brand new one. And this chart right here, it just lays out that new reality perfectly. Almost half of Europe's imported LNG is now coming from one place, the United States. And what does that mean? It means Europe's entire economy is now vulnerable, not just to crazy swings in global energy prices, but also to the unpredictable nature of American politics. So all of this has led to a new buzzword you hear everywhere in Brussels: strategic autonomy. It's a fancy way of saying Europe wants to be the master of its own fate again. And really, there's only one way to do that. It's triggered this absolutely frantic, mind-bogglingly expensive race against time to build out renewables, wind, solar, you name it, and electrify everything as fast as humanly possible. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are breaking down a massive shift in the global economy. We're talking about a high-stakes gamble the European Union is being forced to make because, well, the old rules of global trade, they're gone. And the EU's response could define its entire industrial future. Okay, so for decades, the global economy pretty much operated on one core idea: a level playing field. But a tectonic shift has completely changed the game. The new rule? It's a global subsidy race. And if you're not in it, you are gonna get left behind. So, what caused this huge, sudden change? Well, Europe is suddenly caught right in the middle between two economic superpowers who are aggressively rewriting the rulebook completely on their own terms. First up, you've got the United States. It rolled out its Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which is just a massive package of subsidies designed to pull green technology manufacturing, we're talking batteries, solar panels, EVs, you name it, onto American soil. And then, on the other side, there's China. This has been their long-term strategy for a while now, pouring state money into key industries, which has given them a dominant, and I mean dominant, position in all those same critical technologies. So this put the European Union in what feels like an impossible position. It was facing the very real threat of deindustrialization, companies packing up, capital fleeing to North America, and its own green tech dreams getting crushed. The EU had to do something, and it had to do it fast. So how did Europe respond? Well, with a pretty radical pivot. It decided to abandon its own long-held principles and, essentially, fight fire with fire. You see, historically, the EU has had these incredibly strict rules against something called state aid. The whole idea was to stop richer member countries from just subsidizing their own companies into oblivion, making sure there was fair competition for everyone across the European single market. But facing this enormous external threat, it unveiled the Green Deal Industrial Plan. And this plan basically took that old rulebook and just threw it out the window. State aid rules were drastically relaxed, giving national governments the green light to open the floodgates of public money. And the scope of this thing was just enormous. Suddenly, governments were allowed to pour money into, well, everything. We're talking building out renewable energy, battery factories, decarbonizing heavy industry like steel, and even boosting semiconductor production with the new European Chips Act. Now, this all seemed like a necessary defensive move, right? Protect Europe from the outside. But here's the thing. This solution created a new and maybe even more dangerous internal problem. And here's the absolute core of the issue. When you allow subsidies, it's a game that favors whoever has the deepest pockets. In the EU, that means Germany and France can vastly outspend everyone else. Smaller member states, they simply can't match that kind of fiscal firepower. So what happens? Instead of a united European front, you risk sparking a destructive subsidy race inside Europe itself. And that threatens to fracture the very single market it was all designed to protect, creating these huge imbalances between member states. The sheer urgency of this crisis was laid bare in two landmark reports. They were authored by two former Italian prime ministers, Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta. And believe me, they did not pull any punches. Draghi's report was a massive wake-up call. It delivered what he called a devastating diagnosis, basically concluding that Europe's economy had become stagnant. It was stuck with old industries and suffering from a really serious lack of innovation. And if you need one statistic that just sums this all up, here it is. 0. That's right. Unlike the US and China, which have produced dozens of tech giants, Europe has not created a single new company valued at over 100 billion euros in half a century. 0. So, to catch up, the reports estimate the continent faces a staggering annual investment gap of 800 billion euros. That's how much extra money is needed every single year to fund its goals for the green transition, for digitalization, and for defense. It's a mind-boggling number. Both reports argued that just letting each country fend for itself with subsidies is a dead end. It will only tear the union apart. Their proposed solution was to think bigger. Create a true capital markets union to unlock private savings, and issue new common EU debt to fund competitiveness from the center for everybody. Okay, so we've been talking about some pretty high-level economic stuff. Let's see how this all plays out in the real world. And there is no better test case for Europe's future than its iconic automotive sector. And this is not just any industry. It is an absolute economic engine. We're talking 7% of the EU's total GDP, 170 billion euros in exports, and jobs for nearly 14 million people. It's huge. And right now, it is navigating an incredibly perilous transition to electric cars. It's facing a triple threat. You've got fierce competition from advanced and heavily subsidized Chinese EVs, you have sky-high energy and labor costs at home, and you have incredibly strict new EU emission regulations that are about to hit hard. The fate of Europe's car makers It perfectly encapsulates the entire continent's problem. When you get right down to it, this whole thing boils down to one central, unresolved, and incredibly difficult question.
So, the European Union finds itself at a massive crossroads. A perfect storm of new crises has forced a question that could literally redefine its future. Should its member states face these huge problems alone, or should they face them together? The answer to this trillion-euro question is anything but simple, and frankly, it's pushing the entire EU to the brink.
To really get a grip on what's at stake here, we're going to break this story down into 4 key parts. First, we'll look at the unprecedented bills that are just piling up at the EU's door. Then, we'll explore the revolutionary solution that was born out of the pandemic. We'll also dive into the political double standards that popped up almost immediately. And finally, the massive legal roadblock that could stop a unified fiscal future dead in its tracks.
So let's start with the money. Just how big is the bill that the European Union is facing right now? And look, we're not talking about a single challenge. It's more like a whole bunch of crises all hitting at once, and every single one demands a massive financial response.
At the heart of it all is what you could call a triple funding crisis. It's this perfect storm of massive, non-negotiable investment needs that has thrown this old, very fiery debate about a European fiscal union right back into the spotlight.
Okay, so this huge challenge really boils down to 3 main things. First, you've got the green transition, which is a multi-trillion-euro undertaking on its own. Second, there's this urgent need to secure Europe's economy and rebuild its industrial base. And third, thanks to the war in Ukraine, there's a sudden, pressing need for a massive rearmament of the entire continent's defenses.
To understand the potential way forward, we actually have to look back just a few years. Because when the pandemic hit, the EU did something it had never, ever done before. I mean, it crossed a huge psychological and institutional line.
Right in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, the EU launched this thing called Next Generation EU. And we're talking about a staggering €800 billion recovery fund. The whole point was to pull the continent's economies back from the edge of a cliff.
And this is the absolute key. It wasn't Italy or Spain having to go out and borrow money on their own. Nope. For the very first time, this debt was issued jointly by the European Commission, on behalf of the whole bloc. That was a total game changer.
Right away, people started calling this Europe's Hamiltonian moment. And what that means is a nod to what Alexander Hamilton did in the US centuries ago, pooling state debts to create a stronger federal government. It was seen as this huge leap towards a real fiscal union, finally giving the Eurozone the shared financial firepower it always seemed to be missing.
And wow, when you compare this to how the EU handled the last big crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, the difference is just night and day. I mean, think back. That was all about brutal, economy-crushing austerity forced on countries. This new model? Totally different. It was all about solidarity, giving out massive grants and super favorable loans to help countries modernize and go green.
And the effect was, instant. Seriously. Just the announcement of this plan was enough to calm down financial markets. It brought down borrowing costs for struggling countries and basically stabilized the entire monetary union. It was just this massive proof of how powerful acting together could be.
Okay, so everything's looking pretty good, right? Well, this new spirit of solidarity, it was put to the test almost immediately. And that's when the cracks in the foundation really started to show.
And this, right here, became the single most contentious question in European politics. Was Next Generation EU just a one-time emergency fix? Or was it the blueprint for something permanent, a new way of doing things? And you won't believe where the answer came from.
Germany. The country that's always been the anchor of fiscal conservatism, the one always telling everyone else to follow the rules. Suddenly, they did a complete 180. Faced with their own set of crises, Berlin made a move that was, frankly, historic.
And you can see just how fast this shift happened. For years, Germany had been underinvesting in itself. Then bam, the war in Ukraine hits, and suddenly everyone realizes its military is in pretty bad shape. So what does Berlin do? It starts getting creative, finding all these clever workarounds for its own constitutional debt break, just to fund a ton of new spending.
Now here's what happened next, and this is so important. The European Commission basically gave Germany's plan the green light, even though it was pretty clear it was bending the EU rules. And the reaction was immediate. Critics just cried foul, calling it blatant leniency that threatened to completely undermine the credibility of the entire system.
And this just created this deep, deep sense of fiscal hypocrisy. You had nations that had gone through absolute hell a decade earlier with brutal austerity, and now they're just watching as the rules get bent without a problem for the biggest economy on the continent. You can imagine the political damage that caused.
Which brings us to our final act, and maybe the trickiest part of this whole story, the giant legal wall that makes a permanent solution seem almost impossible.
So you see the trap the EU is in, right? It absolutely has to fund the green transition. It has to rearm its militaries. It has to rebuild its industry. These aren't optional anymore. But at the same time, its own foundational treaties, its own political DNA, demands that it sticks to strict fiscal conservatism. And those two things, they're in total conflict.
So the unavoidable reality, which is getting clearer by the day, is this. There is simply no way Europe can achieve all of these goals at once without some kind of permanent mechanism for joint borrowing. Basically, a permanent version of next-generation EU.
But there's a massive legal roadblock standing in the way, and it comes directly from Germany's highest court, which holds a ton of power over how EU treaties are interpreted.
And the court's ruling is crystal clear. It says, flat out, that next-generation EU cannot become a permanent thing. And the reason? It argues that this kind of mutualized shared debt violates the democratic sovereignty of the German parliament. What this does is it puts a very real, very high legal ceiling on any dream of a true European fiscal union.
So picture this, early 2024, and Europe grinds to a halt. But it wasn't because of a market crash or some big political scandal. Nope, it was tractors. Thousands of them. We're going to dive into what sparked this massive green revolt and why it's a huge deal for all of us. And that is the massive question, right? This wasn't just some small local protest. This was a full-blown, coordinated uprising that literally shook the European Union's entire climate agenda to its core. So what on earth pushed these farmers to the breaking point? To really get the impact here, you first have to understand the sheer scale of what happened. This was a highly organized, continent-wide movement that seemed to catch the establishment completely, and I mean completely, by surprise.
Yeah, we're not talking about a few isolated incidents. These protests just ignited everywhere all at once. From France and Germany to Poland and Spain, it was a totally unified front, sending a crystal clear signal that something was deeply, deeply wrong across the whole European farming sector. And their tactics? Well, they were brutally effective. Farmers used their most powerful tools, their tractors, to just physically shut things down. They blockaded major highways, border crossings, and huge shipping ports. They basically held the continent's entire supply chain hostage.
So, what lit the fuse? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm of pressures that had been building up for years, pushing farmers from every corner of Europe right to the edge. First, let's look at the squeeze from within. You've got the EU's super ambitious Green Deal policies, things like forcing farmers to leave a chunk of their land totally unused. Now, from the farmers' point of view, these weren't just nice green ideas. They were a direct threat to their survival, buried under a mountain of paperwork. And all this was happening while the cost of essentials, like fuel and fertilizer, was just skyrocketing. Then came the pressure from the outside. To help Ukraine, the EU suddenly opened the floodgates to cheap grain imports. Local prices just cratered, driving farmers to the brink of bankruptcy. And at the same time, there was talk of a huge new trade deal with South America. So farmers are sitting there thinking, wait, you're making us follow all these crazy expensive rules, but you're gonna let in cheap food from places that don't? It felt like a battle on two fronts. And this phrase really gets right to the heart of it. This wasn't just about wanting to make a bit more money. The entire farming community saw these pressures as existential threats. For them, this was a fight for the very future of their farms, their families, and their whole way of life. So with the continent paralyzed and critical elections just months away, the political establishment was, to put it mildly, panicked. What happened next was a stunningly fast and total capitulation. You see, the timing of these protests was absolutely perfect. They blew up just before the 2024 European Parliament elections. The establishment looked at this wave of rural anger and saw a massive political risk, that all this frustration would be fuel for right-wing populist parties. That fear forced their hand. And the U-turn was unbelievably fast. We're talking weeks. Within just a few weeks of the protests peaking, the EU started gutting its own flagship green policies. The plan to slash pesticide use? Scrapped. The mandatory land follow rule? Suspended. The big nature restoration law? Watered down. It was a complete political surrender. And it wasn't just about changing the rules either. National governments started throwing money at the problem. hundreds of millions of euros in emergency aid and tax breaks, all to try and calm things down. It was a pretty clear sign of just how much power the farmers had managed to unleash. So what's the bigger picture here? What can we learn from all this? Well, this whole episode is a profound lesson in the hard political realities of trying to build a green economy, not just in Europe, but frankly, anywhere.
The crucial takeaway is this. The Revolt showed that a purely top-down approach to the green transition is incredibly fragile. If the economic pain is seen as unfairly hitting one specific, well-organized group, like farmers, the whole agenda can fall apart in the blink of an eye.
This all comes down to the core idea of transition costs. Now that sounds like a dry, academic term, but it's really not. It's about the very real burdens, the new regulations, the higher prices, the threat to your job, that people have to deal with during a massive economic shift. At its heart, the farmer protest was a rebellion against being told, you have to bear all these costs.
And this leaves us with the ultimate question, one that goes way beyond Europe. Pretty much everyone agrees on the goal. We need to get to climate neutrality. But this revolt forces us all to confront the much, much harder question. How do we actually get there? And who is expected to pay the price?